May I request Dr. Rupinder Kaur, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Shri Vaishnav Vidyapeeth Vishwavidyalaya, to share words of wisdom.
This occasion, Ambassador Dr. Deepak Bhojwani, coordinator for today's program, Dr. Rajiv Shukla, all directors, heads of institutions, HODs sitting in the audience, all faculty colleagues, friends from the press, and dear friends. At the outset, I would like to welcome Dr. Bhojwani to our campus and also thank him for accepting our invitation to visit Indore and share his experiences with all of us. As we know that times are changing very fast, we know that we have a demographic dividend in the country, a very large population are going to come when businesses, economy, and other kinds of organizations of all the countries in the world will be managed by Indian youth. The reason is that all other countries are aging. Very recently I had gone to the United States, where I visited about 8 states. As all of you know that the United States has 50 states. I visited 8 states in the last 1 month and found, wherever I went, most of the people who are managing the affairs are in the higher age group. Very few young people can be seen. This is an indicator that what we see on paper that the population is aging there, which is true, that is the reflection of what we have been reading. Therefore, there is a great scope to work for our students anywhere in the world. They have to, so far as the work is concerned, they have to be the work citizens and be prepared to work anywhere. But for that, preparedness is necessary. Understanding of cross-cultural issues is important. They must know how to deal with people who come from different backgrounds. As you know that we have memorandum of understanding with St. Cloud State University. In last conference also we had a professor or dean from St. Cloud University who participated in the conference. I had a meeting, in fact series of meetings there with the president of St. Cloud State University, which happens to be more than 150 years old. And the outcome of our discussion was that this year, now coming session, we will have more than one professor. Last year we had one professor who was teaching here, who taught students of automobile engineering. And in the coming session, we will have at least 3 or 4 professors from here, from different streams. In St. Cloud State University, computer science engineering is very strong, so we may be having a professor in artificial intelligence, we may be having a professor in business administration and so on. It is important. Why? Why are we doing it? Intention is to give an international perspective. Intention is to give an exposure to the students so that they understand how people are taught in other countries, particularly the United States. In addition to that, St. Cloud State University has accepted the quality of education that we are offering and the scholarship of our professors, and they have invited one professor this year who will be going to St. Cloud, Minnesota and teaching there for 3 weeks. We are also having an agreement for student exchange. Some of our students can go to Minnesota, as we know that Minnesota is very rich in industry. There are a number of well-known industries there, well-known companies like Electrolux is there, 3M is there, and so on, where our students can do the internship. Even they can attend some classes there, complete some unit of the syllabus there, which will be a supplement to what they are being taught here. Similarly, there may be some students coming from US to our campus. All this exercise is done to give an international exposure to all faculty and students, because that is need of the hour. As you may be remembering that Padam Bhushan Atre was here few months back, only last month, 2 months back, he made a point that we do have demographic dividend, but how long? It's not a permanent phenomenon. We may have largest population in the youngest population in the work age group, but then how long? Maybe 20 years, 25 years. Therefore, we have to see it as an opportunity and do what best we can do, so that our students are well equipped, our teachers are well equipped to go anywhere in the world. It is in this line that today we have Dr. Deepak Bhojwani with us, who will be sharing his vast experience, very rich experience that he has, particularly in international relations. He has been ambassador to a number of countries, and how business is done there, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, say particularly in Latin America, say Brazil, and what we need to do, how we need to strengthen ourselves so that we are no less in any way. So I am sure that this session will be very much useful for all of us, and all of us will be paying full attention to what Dr. Bhojwani ji will be sharing with us. So once again, I would like to welcome Dr. Bhojwani to our university. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for enlightening us. Eminent people do not require any introduction. In line with the tradition, may I request Dr. Rajiv Shukla, Director, Sri Vaishnav School of Management, to introduce Ambassador Dr. Deepak Bhojwani to the gathering. Sir, please.
Opportunity to introduce Ambassador Deepak Bhojwani to the audience. Ambassador Deepak Bhojwani joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1978. He served abroad in 3 continents, in Asia, Indonesia and Malaysia, in Europe, Spain and Czech Republic, and in Latin America. During his career, he served as ambassador in 7 Latin American countries: Colombia, Venezuela, Cuba, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, and in Sao Paulo. In the Ministry of External Affairs, he served in the divisions dealing with administrations, West Asia and North Africa, US and Canada, and had a brief stint at the United Nations. Ambassador Bhojwani also served as Private Secretary to the Prime Minister of India, Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, for 2 years from 1994 to 1996, and as a Special Assistant to the Minister of State for External Affairs and for Science and Technology, Mr. K.R. Narayanan, from 1985 to 1988. Ambassador Bhojwani writes extensively on Latin America and its relation with India. He has written a book published in 2015 titled Latin America, the Caribbean and India, Promise and Challenge. He left down office in February 2012 from Indian Foreign Service and is currently a consultant for Latin America and the Caribbean through his firm Lat India. Ambassador Bhojwani also serves as independent director on the board of Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited, one of the largest state oil and gas companies of India. Since January 2017, he has been country manager and director, Microtex Industries Private Limited. Now I request Ambassador Deepak Bhojwani to address the audience on the theme India's relations with Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome, sir.
Our friends, Dr. Upinder Dhar, Vice Chancellor, Vaishnav Vidyapith Vishwavidyalaya, Dr. Rajiv Shukla, Honorable HODs, and leading lights of this institution. It's an honor for me to be here, and I don't say those words lightly. I'm not a doctor. I was an ambassador, and I firmly believe in the Constitution of India, which has abolished all titles. So you are entitled to your degree appellation, but I am just Deepak Bhojwani. That's how I'd like you to know me and remember me. It's an honor, as I said, to be here because I consider myself a student till the day I die. And to be here among so many teachers is a little intimidating, as it is an honor, because I don't know if I can hold your interest the way you would hold mine if you were to teach me what you know. Now, having said that, and I'm not considered a modest person, I don't consider myself to be, but honestly, I thought that if I have this opportunity, what I would really like to do is share some of my experiences, thoughts, and ideas, and if possible, get your feedback on what you think about a part of the world where I was fortunate to serve this nation, Latin America and the Caribbean. I have some experience in foreign affairs in other continents and in other aspects of our work, also in other aspects of our international relations. I'd be happy to talk about that. But given the time at my disposal, I'd like to focus on a part of the world first and what we have done there, what I have experienced there. So if you permit me, I'd like to be among you and show you a little bit on the map first, what is the region. What we call Latin America, really, what we call Latin America extends from Mexico, which is here, which I'm sure you all know well, all the way through the Isthmus of Central America, and then the continent of South America, which goes all the way down to Chile, which would be roughly, which would right here we have it, here we have it. We down to Cape Horn, which is the, and below this is the Antarctic. If we go further north, you get all the way to Mexico. Now, just to give you an idea, because this is very important, we see the world map as the Mercator projection. The Mercator projection is a European projection, Eurocentric. It was created by the Europeans for Europe and by Europe. And if you have Europe as the center, then South America appears not as large as it really is. India, for instance, on this side, appears to be the size of Brazil. Fact is that Brazil is 2.5 times, 2.6 times to be exact, the size of India. Then you all of this part of Brazil is heavily forested. It is really virgin jungle, which we hope will remain that way for the sake of the rest of the world. And it extends almost till down here. Most of Brazil, the population is concentrated here. Imagine India fitting into this much of South America. That is the reality. We have Chile here. If you can just take the map down, sir. Chile from the Tarapacá, from the northern Atacama Desert, all the way south, further south, till Punta Arenas, and till the Tierra del Fuego, which is down here, is 4,000 kilometers, which, if I'm not mistaken, is longer than the distance from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. So just to give you an idea about the dimensions of this incredible part of the world, of which I knew very little, and I think from my understanding, most people in India know very little about. Now, to just give us an idea about what we are talking about, Argentina is approximately 70% the size of India. Mexico is about 66% the size of India. We're talking about huge dimensions, huge distances. From Sao Paulo, which is the commercial capital, it's like the Bombay of Brazil, to Mexico City is longer than the distance from Delhi to Beijing. It is a world of its own. This continent has the largest resources of fresh water in the world, between 15 and 20%, depending upon the estimates you take. of fresh water exists over here. We have some of the largest agricultural zones in the world. Brazil here is the world's leading exporter of meat. India follows. It also exports, this part of the continent exports soya. We import edible oils from this part of the world, billions of dollars worth every year. It also has fruits. It also has wheat. It also has sugar. Brazil is the largest sugar producing country in the world. We are number 2. They have everything you can imagine, from fruits to cereals to cattle to meat. Almost everything exists in this part of the world. In fact, some of it, if we go back into the history, dates back to the exchanges that took place between the Jesuits who were in India. In the late 15th century, they got to India. The 16th century, they started working in India and Brazil. And these Jesuits took back chilies from one continent, bananas from another, potatoes, and so on and so forth. So we had a very healthy interchange of agriculture, which continues till today, because the Brazilian Embrapa and our ICAR, Indian Council for Agricultural Research, have a very healthy exchange. We have MOUs, etc., dating for 30, 40 years. We're doing common research in bamboo, the utilization of bamboo. There was a Brazilian who in fact constructed the India Pavilion at the Chinese Expo, if I'm not mistaken, in 2010 or 11, all in bamboo. And this kind of thing is under the public radar because for some reason we don't publicize it, we don't pick it up. Anyway, to come to the history, by the way, sorry, to also give you an idea, because I was thinking we start with geography first. I'm not an academician, but I think it's important. The geography, the mineral content over here. Brazil is the largest exporter of iron ore in the world. It also is a huge exporter of crude oil. Crude oil from Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil constitutes approximately about 10 to 15% of our crude oil imports annually. We import between 10 and 15 billion dollars of this product, and our oil companies have invested billions of dollars in Colombia, in Venezuela, and in Brazil to exploit oil and keep oil equity, since we don't want to just be an importer. We want to actually be in the business. Just as an example, we get gold from all these countries. $3 billion worth of gold has come from here. They have other minerals also. Copper from Chile, which constitutes almost $1 billion import from Chile to India, and other minerals also. So the mineral wealth of this region is immense. It is comparable with any region in the world, and in some ways it surpasses. So this is the geography we are talking about. Apart from the fact that the Panama Canal connects the world, both the hemispheres, the western and the eastern, and will be even more important because what is happening is that it has been enlarged recently with a $5 billion investment. So it's taking even bigger and bigger ships, and we will be hopefully benefiting from this. The history is that around the time the Europeans started coming to India, they also started coming here. The Portuguese came around a couple of years before to Brazil, and the Spaniards came, as we know. It was Christopher Columbus, who was actually an Italian, who was commissioned by the King and Queen of Spain, which is why Spain is seen as the colonizing country. Christopher Columbus actually was asking the King and Queen of England to finance his campaign to discover the new world, because at that time there was still some confusion as to whether you could actually sail around the world. People thought the world was flat, people didn't know what to expect, and this man single-handedly took it upon himself to sail west and see what he could find. He landed up somewhere here in the Bahamas, the island of the Bahamas, in his first visit. The second visit, he came to the Dominican Republic, where he set up a small settlement, and the third visit, he actually came to Central America. He didn't even hit South America. South America was first hit by Americo Vespucci, who was an Italian. And from there, the continent is named, or this entire hemisphere is named America. That's how it happened. Then you had other colonizers, other discoverers, etc. Magellan, who sailed around the south around the Straits of Magellan, which is why it's called the Magellan Strait. He was called Magallanes. He was a Spaniard. He sailed around and he discovered this, that the fact that you could actually go through, because by the time Columbus discovered, there was no Panama Canal. So this was the only way of sailing from the Atlantic, which is the eastern hemisphere, into the western hemisphere. All these discoveries were made over the period of decades. But gradually what happened was that the cross first followed, no, sorry, the imperial power first followed the discoverers, and along with it they brought the cross, which is the religion. And between the religion and the colonizers, the armies, they managed to dominate this entire part of the world and part of what is the United States today. The French came and the British came and took over what was the northern hemisphere, but this southern hemisphere and Central America were dominated by the Spaniards and the Portuguese. The Spaniards then turned to the Pope because there was a fight between Spain and Brazil over who should dominate. The Brazilians by that time had already reached India, and they settled on the western coast, initially around Calicut, Kerala, and then went further north where they settled in Goa eventually. Whereas the Spaniards and the Portuguese here were fighting for this, and the Pope in 1498 through the Treaty of Tordesillas decided that, okay, the western part of the world would belong to Spain and the eastern part to Portugal. That was it. It was decided, and the eastern part, Brazil, was carved out by the Portuguese and more or less extended here, and then they established their borders over the period of the next 1 or 2 centuries. And so you see here, all this is Spanish speaking. Brazil is the only Portuguese speaking country in the hemisphere. You have then here, all these also are Spanish speaking, all the way up to Mexico. And you have in the Caribbean a few Spanish speaking countries, Cuba prominently, Dominican Republic and so on, and also some English speaking ex-colonies which are today independent, like Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana and so on, which were settled by the British, conquered back from the Spaniards, etc., went back and forth, and a few French colonies. Now, what happened was that after the the Spanish and the Portuguese settled out here, they basically colonized, they wiped out a lot of the indigenous populations, and then found that they had nobody to work the land, because their primary purpose was economic exploitation, somewhat like the British. The British dominated those who were politically still nominally in charge, like our Maharajas, whereas here there were no Maharajas. There were some tribal chieftains of the Mayas, the Aztecs, and the Incas who were either wiped out, dominated, subjugated, but they never managed to retain their feudal rights like our Maharajas did till independence. So what you really had, the difference, civilizational difference between Latin America and India, is that when the colonies got independence in the early 19th century, almost all of this got independence, what remained were the ruling classes who had come from foreign lands, because there were no indigenous people left worth the name. Few traces, and mostly through miscegenation, they had turned into hybrids, what you call Creoles, who were mixed. But the dominant class, the ruling class till today, is what was European. As the difference between India, even Africa, after the colonizers left, they actually left physically. A few of them may have remained, like in South Africa, Zimbabwe, etc. But in most of Asia, it's the indigenous people who have taken back their countries and who rule. Similarly in Africa, the difference is here that because these people were of European origin and they stayed behind their rule, they took independence from their own predecessors, so to speak. But obviously their orientation was towards Europe, because they didn't have an indigenous orientation. They had come either as plunderers or as agriculturists or whatever. And by then they had not set up very much apart from feudal lands which they were exploiting. And to exploit those lands, once the indigenous populations had dwindled, they got slaves from Africa. So today you have this very interesting racial mix of white, red, which is the indigenous, and black, which is the African. Some countries, particularly in the Caribbean, are predominantly of African origin, some in the Caribbean also, whereas you have Brazil, which is very, very mixed also. You have Colombia, which has some indigenous African populations, and you have other countries also. It's a big mix. Whereas down south, further, Peru, Bolivia, etc., have a much higher percentage of the original indigenous populations, which have not been mixed so much. So it's a fascinating kaleidoscope of colors, of races, even languages. There are ethnicities and languages that survive over here, which I won't go into for lack of time. What has happened, but, is that the feudal nature of Latin America impeded to a certain extent the growth of political democracy and the political economy. What mainly occurred was sort of after the independence of the colonies, they sort of accepted to some extent that imperial Europe would be the guiding light. But they began to start developing their own countries through strong men. And these strong men guided the destinies of most of these countries well into the 20th century. When the strong men sort of failed or faded away, what you had was the army, the military, or other forces that took control. And by and large, most of these economies were left to function in a very feudal manner. There was no equivalent of the abolition of zamindari that took place in India, by which there was a higher level of egalitarianism that came about, at least in India. Here, you still have people, you have private landholders who have, in this area of of Brazil, landholdings that are the size of Haryana, one of them, the biggest. You have people who have 80,000 acre holdings, and it's considered, all right, this is it, this is my jaidad, this is my and so on. So you have a huge, I mean, of course, in some ways it helps for industrial farming, but in many ways it creates a tremendous amount of inequality, and the Gini coefficient of this region is among the highest in the world. So we did see economic progress taking place, but a lot of it was largely due to exploitation of natural resources. And regrettably, that continues till today. And what you call the Dutch disease, which is when the Dutch discovered oil, and they got so lazy, they didn't develop their own resources. Of course, that's now, it's different today. But these people are still suffering, many of these countries are suffering from the Dutch disease, in particular Venezuela, which has discovered recently, in the early 20th century, that they actually have certified the highest crude oil reserves in the world, more than even Saudi Arabia. So we're talking about a sea of oil sitting under this much, which is a territory which is approximately about 15 to 20% the size of India. We still import oil from Venezuela. It's a heavy oil, not a very good quality, but still, it's huge. And it has sustained the Venezuelan economy, but because of mismanagement, Venezuela finds itself in more trouble now, and I'm sure this is common knowledge, than almost any country in the world. It's a failed economy, it's a failed state because of mismanagement. And this is a typical example of how the blessings of largesse can be a curse. It has turned into a curse for Venezuela. Brazil, the biggest country on the other hand, has managed to get out of the trap of anti-democracy, which is strong men, strong military, reliance on a system which will prevail through corrupt, nepotist kind of connections, with the rich being supported by the government and vice versa. It came into a democracy. And early this century, it had a government which was left-wing for about 10, 12 years and brought 40 million people out of poverty. The government of Lula da Silva. Unfortunately, even that government was not free of the curse of corruption. Now, you and I might feel that corruption in this country is huge and so on and so forth, but I can guarantee you, if you live in Latin America, at least you will be satisfied with the fact that we have a very institutional presence among our courts, among our CDC or whoever we have, and of course the media, which ensures that anything that is considered worth hiding by people in power, including business, is brought to light when and if it is discovered. It's not always the case in Latin America. You find still today that there is so much corruption hidden beneath what appears to be legitimate, that it's almost impossible to eradicate. It's very deep-rooted. And this is the central challenge of Latin America today, because it is such a rich part of the world, such a rich continent, such a rich region, that almost any government can get away with making deals which are not to the entire benefit of the people. It's not as if it increases poverty, but it decreases the prospect for development, which they can achieve. Today, Latin America has a per capita income of approximately $10,000 per year, which is huge compared to that of India. Of course, the populations are smaller, but still. What has also happened is that the region is very disparate. It gives an appearance on the surface of homogeneity because of language, because of a certain common ethos, perhaps European, and of course the fact that it is also being dominated by the US, so to a large extent, economically, it has had a kind of uniform tendency in terms of its industrialization, its development, its human resources, and so on and so forth. But underneath that surface, it is essentially very disparate. You will, as I told you, in terms of its own complexion, you have indigenous races, you have African origin races, you have white races, you have different tendencies. You have recent migrations, like in Paraguay, the German migration, which has a very different attitude towards economic development, towards the exercise of power. And it leads to a certain, it's kind of oligopoly. So this is as compared to, say, for instance, Brazil, where there's a far more active political contention taking place, or Mexico, which has just recently elected a left-wing government after 2-3 decades of very active political life. In fact, the Mexican example is very, very interesting because early in the 20th century, it was under a dictator, went through tremendous turmoil. There was, early in the 20th century, a movement, the Zapatistas, Pancho Villa and Zapata, who basically wanted to pull the country away from a strongman rule and oligopolistic rule. And they didn't succeed because the business interests and the interests of the US, which swallowed up about 60% of what was then Mexico. I mean, California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico were all parts of Mexico. But after the emperors sort of managed to concede most of this territory of Mexico, it fell in the hands of contending forces, left and right. The left was defeated and the right came in. The Partido Revolucionario Institucional, PRI, which held power for 70 years after Porfirio Diaz, the dictator, passed on. And till the early 20th century, the PRI ruled in Congress, which is the parliament, and in the presidency. And after that, for approximately 20 years, 15, 16 years, there was the rule of two other parties, which were more or less center-right. And these two parties, the PRI and the PAN, managed to hold the presidency and managed to introduce more democratic reform, which means getting away from big business. And we're talking about big business the size of an Ambani or a Mittal or something like that, really huge business houses which control the economy, and managed to diversify it a little bit. But still, the problem with these countries is that the human resource development is so low that you really have big business either using resources from some other countries or relying upon technology from other countries. So it's not really indigenous. You don't have the equivalent of a TCS or an Infosys in Latin America. I'll come to that. So now, recently, and last year, they elected, this year, they elected a left-wing government, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and we have to see how that will translate into the politics and the economy of Mexico, because he has promised to pull it away from the US and from the US dominance. But he has to also contend with differing forces. Also, what do you do? Mexico is an oil-producing country. So will he allow foreign investment in, or will he go more chauvinistic? Because in 1938, Mexico nationalized the oil industry, and it has not done all that well. It produced more in the past. It began slipping because it's very capital intensive. So you need foreign technology, foreign capital. So the new government is considering how much it should take back from the foreign investment. Brazil, similar. It also has a very thriving energy industry. It also has very, very large paper industry, pulp industry, agro industry, and so on. Argentina similarly also has a tremendous stake in what to do with its resources. Now here we come to the modern world. In the modern world, you need capital, you need technology, and you need human resources, right? The natural resources we take as a given, all right? And if you don't take it as a given, like in the case of Chile, for instance, then you import the natural resources and you re-export. Like Chile, for instance, has no energy resources of its own, so it imports the energy. But in most cases, the three essential elements are technology, capital, and human resources, not necessarily in that order. So you have all these countries now, which, by the way, through the second half of the 20th century, the Indian connection was established after we got our independence in 1947. And very early on, countries like Argentina, Brazil, and so on established diplomatic relations because Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had started getting an appreciation. And here, I must admit, we must recognize that Pandit Nehru's vision, this is the importance of vision of a leader. In the 1930s, he started appreciating that there was a similarity between Latin America and India, both under colonial subjugation. He didn't know how things would develop, but he said that we need to get closer to Latin America because they are also colonized. They were under foreign rule, although they are now independent, but they still suffer from that hangover. So he tried to get closer, and he did, which resulted in tremendous amount of empathy and establishment of diplomatic relations soon after independence. And in fact, Brazil, Argentina, and certain other countries established embassies in India even before we did over there. But then we were a new democracy with limited resources, so we didn't have the wherewithal they had, and we started establishing. Today we have 20 embassies of Latin America in India, in Delhi, and we have 14 embassies in the region. Now, why do I say this? It's because we started getting to know modern Latin America after our independence very largely, but the rest of the world had already gone much further. You had the US, which dominated the region, and in fact, as early as the 19th century, the early 20th century, sorry, you had President Monroe, who laid down the Monroe Doctrine. When the US took charge of the hemisphere and had liberated Cuba, which was the last colony of Spain to be liberated, by a certain maneuver, they said that from now on, from 1903, when the Monroe Doctrine was enunciated, this area shall not be under the domination of Europe anymore. And if the Europeans intervened, it would be against the US national interest, which was a very important statement to make. It meant that the US would be willing to go to war with a European power that tried to meddle in the continent's affairs without having legitimate reason to do so. And that led to a certain domination of the region by the US, including in terms of toppling governments, whether in Central America or in South America, interfering wherever it felt that communism was coming about, and so on and so forth. By and large, Latin America and the Caribbean stayed aloof from the world wars. They didn't get involved. They were neutral, they had their own business, and they did not have the resources or the manpower or the armies or the navies to fight. They got belatedly involved in the Second World War, Brazil and Argentina, and that also by chance on the side of the Allies, on the right side. But because of their sort of neutrality, you had tremendous amount of Germans, including Nazis, who came fleeing from Europe after the Second World War, who settled in these countries and hid away, some of whom were found later. Now, the European influence subsisted. The American influence grew, and obviously because of its capital, its technology, and its wherewithal, the Americans dominated this region economically and politically. Come the second half of the 20th century, Russia also entered the scene, and through certain countries like Cuba, which had gone communist by then, as I mentioned, there was a tremendous undercurrent of egalitarianism, which eventually led to a certain resurgence of the left in this region. Even before Cuba got its independence, there were tremendous amount of left-wing movements in Peru, in Guatemala and so on, which was suppressed by the US or dominated. And through the second half of the 20th century, after Cuba got its sort of communist government in 1959, Chile also got a communist government in the late 1960s and so on, and the US had a hard time trying to stamp out communism in this part of the world. Meanwhile, there were legitimate left-wing currents like Raul Prebisch in Argentina, who along with Dr. Manmohan Singh and others forged the South-South cooperation movement, the new international economic order, which started from here. Raul Prebisch in Argentina was a leading light of what was considered the South-South cooperation. He said that we have to rely upon our own resources. We have to rely upon import substitution. Why should we drive General Motors and Ford when we can develop cars of our own? We have the technology, we have the intellect, we have the manpower. This was in the 60s. It didn't go, he started in the 40s, and the movement sort of developed through Julius Nyerere in Africa, Dr. Manmohan Singh in India, and others. Didn't get very far, unfortunately, because as we see, and this I won't go into because there are people more competent than me to comment upon why this happened and why it didn't go very far. The new international economic order did not develop in the manner we thought it would. Even Dr. Manmohan Singh himself indirectly perhaps admitted that the way to go is by a mix of capitalist moves and technology, with the catalyst of technology and of course human resources to develop our economy. And that's what is happening today. What is happening is that India has decided that we will have bilateral relations with the different countries. We cannot deal with the continent as one, too huge. And we don't have the diplomatic strength nor the will, I dare say, because there are hardly any big high-level visits to this part of the world like you see in Africa or you see in Asia. I mean, prime ministers going every year twice to Japan or China or Russia or wherever in Asia. Prime Minister, forget about Prime Minister Modi. We haven't had a bilateral Prime Minister visit to this region since Rajiv Gandhi visited Cuba in 1985. All the visits of the Prime Ministers since then have been for multilateral conferences. Narasimha Rao visited in 1995 Latin America for the G15. Manmohan Singh visited in 1996 in Cuba for the non-aligned. Prime Minister Modi went for the BRICS meeting to Brazil in 2014, but not bilateral, which means you're not telling these countries that they matter. What you're telling them is that, okay, we've got this meeting which is nothing to do with your country. I'm coming for the BRICS, I'm coming for the non-aligned, I'm coming for this and that. I mean, I sound a little harsh, but after having lived and worked there and analyzed it for almost 2 decades now, I feel that we have done ourselves a disfavor. We really do not recognize the importance of this continent the way China does. We have become a member of BRICS, and in fact, before BRICS, fortunately, some reason prevailed, some sense had dawned on us, and with Brazil, which was our primary partner in Latin America and still today is our primary partner, although it's coming down in terms of economic exchanges, we established what is called the IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, South-South cooperation. If you see the map, South Africa and India. So we decided we'd have a triangular cooperation which includes research, technology, human resource development, to some extent some political sort of like-mindedness also, but primarily small steps to see if we can do things together and increase our cooperation and increase thereby our partnership. This was in 2003. Within 4 years, the BRICS had come. The BRIC had come about. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China. And Brazil there again was a very, very strong partner for India. And then China and Russia coming into the mix. Now, it was felt that why not include South Africa also? So that's what happened. BRICS came into being, if I'm not mistaken, in 2009, which included South Africa also. And today, the centerpiece of our collaboration is BRICS. Now, even this, there is a tremendous amount of commonality between Brazil and India under the BRICS, but it is dominated by China. And to some extent, the politics of BRICS, whether it's defense of Syria, or whether it's the issue of nuclear disarmament or terrorism, is sort of contentious because you might have Russia taking one stand, you have India taking another, and so on and so forth. So it's very hard for us to find common cause. But yet, with Brazil, we have managed to maintain the centerpiece of our political ideology, which is that the world order today, the world political order, which was established under the Bretton Woods system after World War II, whereby 5 countries who were the victors in World War II are permanent members of the UN Security Council, including members like France and Britain, who are important countries but have been overtaken by India in terms of GDP and in terms of political weight, are still given privileged places in the UN Security Council and make decisions which impact the rest of the world. This is unacceptable. So, a long time ago, many years ago, we started, I think 2004 if I'm not mistaken, was the G4, Brazil, India, Japan and Germany claimed the seat on the UN Security Council, a permanent seat. Now this has become a problem because if Brazil says it wants to represent Latin America and India says it wants to represent Asia along with China, we have of course the problem of Mexico, we have Argentina here who says that why Brazil, why not us? Or don't have permanent membership, have a sort of a halfway house, semi-permanent membership or something like that. In the case of India, we have of course Pakistan which resists our membership. So Brazil and India have this bond where we both recognize that we are the key countries in our regions, which are the next step in terms of world recognition, not just in the Security Council, but even in institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, where today decisions are taken because Brazil has a GDP of over 2 trillion. India's GDP per capita is even higher, and in absolute terms and in per capita terms, we feel that why should we have to have a European on the board as chair of the IMF and an American always, or a South Korean, whoever is the person nominated by the US or approved by the US on the World Bank. So these issues are coming up, and there is now a very lively cooperation in terms of how should we democratize world politics and the world political economy. And Brazil and India are very strong partners in this. We are trying also to make sure that Argentina, Mexico and other influential countries in this region understand our point of view. One of the challenges we had was our nuclear program, because in 1967, this entire region, and this is interesting, in 1967, all these countries, all of them unanimously signed on to the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco is a place in Mexico where they all got together and signed on a treaty saying that none of our countries will have a nuclear weapon, we will not develop a nuclear weapon, and we will not allow the development of nuclear weapons, nor the stationing or storage of nuclear weapons in this entire region. And they called upon the world to accede to that treaty. India acceded. We recognize that if this region, this is what they want, we will not do that. All the world powers have acceded, and they have set up an institution called the OPANAL, which actually monitors the Treaty of Tlatelolco and the principles it has set down, which means this entire region is a nuclear weapon-free zone. Now when that happened, Argentina and Brazil were well on the way to developing nuclear weapons. So what this says about these countries is that they have chosen the path of abjuring weapons of mass destruction. To some extent they could do so because they did not have any existential threat. In India we had the 1962 war with China, we've had problems with Pakistan ever since, so as a result of which we've always felt that we are insecure and we need to defend ourselves. And subsequent history has shown us, in my opinion and the opinion of most analysts who are not completely against our nuclear option, that we need to at least have the capability to defend ourselves if it comes to an existential threat. These countries didn't feel that, nor did Mexico. So as a result, they decided that forget about the nuclear option, we don't need it. They do have nuclear energy though, but for peaceful purposes only. So this is a major difference between India and these countries. There was also the issue of Kashmir, on which initially the Latin American countries didn't support us. There was the issue of non-alignment also. As you all know, non-alignment means we are not with this or with that power. We want to be neutral. We will work with both USSR and the US and the NATO, and we will not take sides. And of course, we will not be involved in military alliances with either side. Latin Americans didn't go along with that initially, but now most of them have signed on. So there were these issues which were sorted out, and today, happily, most of our political ideas coincide. In fact, Mexico recently, oh, by the way, I must correct myself, Prime Minister Modi made a very brief halt of half a day to Mexico last year. So it's embarrassing because they really wanted him on a bilateral visit, and Mexico is a very important country. It's our largest trading partner today in Latin America. But he made a half-day visit to try and convince them that Mexico should support us in the nuclear suppliers group. As you know, the nuclear suppliers group is a very important group of countries which has access to nuclear technology. Some of these countries are, of course, the 5 nuclear weapon powers. And if we get access to this, then we get access to nuclear technology, which is a slight problem for us. And we also get to export that nuclear technology. So till today, we are not a member of the NSG, largely because China is blocking our entry, and we are trying to build up a sort of lobby within the NSG, which includes Mexico and Brazil. And that's why Prime Minister Modi made that half-day visit to Mexico, as a result of which Mexico softened its stand on India and said that we should consider this Indian. So this is, we don't realize that Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and maybe other countries eventually are going to be important to India, because these 3 countries are in the G20. In fact, this month, next week, if I'm not mistaken, the Prime Minister is going to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, where they're going to hold the G20 summit, where he will be meeting with Latin Americans and others. So there is a tremendous amount of political importance to these countries. Apart, of course, the basic importance is the economic. In 1990, our bilateral trade amounted to about $500 million. Now, even if you take the devaluation into account, it was peanuts compared, the value of the rupee and the dollar, it was peanuts compared to what it became in 2013, when it hit its peak of almost $50 billion. Today, it's around $40 billion, which is not insignificant, considering that countries like Brazil and Mexico, if you don't count the strategic trade between India and Russia, which means the amount of arms we buy from Russia and so on, if you exclude that, our trade with Brazil and Mexico is higher than our trade with Russia. Our trade with Argentina is higher than our trade, say, with Thailand. Things like this, which we don't realize, because individually these countries matter a lot. Of course, the problem here is that very often they are linked to single commodities. Like in the case of Chile, for instance, our bilateral trade may be about $2 billion, of which about $700–800 million is import of copper from Chile. Similarly with Brazil, about $2–3 billion is import of oil out of $7 billion. In the case of Venezuela, 98% is oil import. In the case of Argentina, over $1 billion worth of edible oil, and so on and so forth. So the problem for them is that they are dependent on their natural resources and single commodities to sustain their trade with India. India, on the other hand, has done much better, because through sheer entrepreneurship, through a tremendous marketing effort, we have managed to start selling cars. We have Maruti cars being sold here, we have Mahindra cars being assembled here, we have Bajaj Auto and Hero Honda, which have assemblies in Latin America. In fact, Hero Honda in Colombia has set up a $70 million investment plant in Colombia to assemble its Hero motorcycle. We're doing very well. Mexico here is the principal importer of Indian-made cars in the world. Almost $2.5 billion of cars are imported by Mexico every year. We're talking about Volkswagen, but they're assembled here. Every I-10 and I-20 that is a taxi in Colombia is made by Hyundai in India and exported there. So this shows Mahindra has a plant right here in the middle of the Amazon forest, assembling its Scorpios and other vehicles. Maruti is being sold all over. Two-wheelers, huge. Bajaj is a household name in Latin America. So this shows you what strength we have. Pharmaceuticals, we are all over the place. You name it, about 15 companies. Torrent has set up actual manufacturing facilities in Brazil. Strides did the same several years ago. You have IPCA, which is all over. Cipla, which is all over. Mexico, Lupin has just bought and is developing its own. Birla over here, which has bought aluminium plants and is doing aluminium business out here. Sri Renuka Sugars, which bought 2 sugar plants to develop over there. Huge investments, multi-billion-dollar investments have gone into the region. Hydrocarbons, as I mentioned to you, ONGC is in Venezuela, in Colombia, and in Brazil. Bharat Petroleum, company to which I belong currently, has also got a $2 billion investment in Brazil. And all these, in the coming years, some of them have already started yielding dividends and equity oil. But in coming years, we are going to see billions of dollars worth of oil and profits, dividends coming to India from these natural resources. There are companies that are going into agriculture also. So, I mean, what I'm talking about is a huge penetration, but the penetration is benevolent. Now, here I would like to point out a very interesting feature. Let me also give you an idea about the infotech industry. As Professor Dhar said, we have a tremendous demographic dividend. This demographic dividend has led us to develop our IT industry to the point where we have a company like TCS, which is present in the region, with 25,000 Latin Americans working for it. 25,000. And I was told by the TCS manager, they don't call them employees, they call them cooperators, consultants. So they have 25,000 Latin Americans working and trained by them. Approximately 400 or 500 Indians who manage all these people who live there. So that what you have is that when you are servicing, say, the US market, you don't have to be awake in India. You can be awake here, the same time zone. You also have the same language because the US has a 30% Hispanic speaking population. So you access them. It's called nearshoring. Infosys, Wipro, you name it. Almost every IT company, and some even very little known in India, are present over here in this region. And we are appreciated because we train their people, we employ their people, and we pay their people well. And we have developed their expertise in this very vital sphere, which is the futuristic sphere, and we're going to go much further. So all you see about India here is a tremendous amount of benevolent investment, benevolent business. That's what I'd like to call it. You also have a tremendous cultural influence over here. Now you see, earlier in the 20th century, there was a tremendous migration from Japan, which was very poor in the early 20th century, and China. A lot of them came and settled down in the US, and they were thrown out of the US out of the Second World War, came down through Mexico into Latin America. The former president of Peru, Fujimori, was of Japanese origin, still holds a Japanese passport. You have Chinese, Japanese presence in Brazil. The largest Japanese community outside of Japan is here, 2 million people of Japanese origin, 4th, 5th generation. They don't speak much Japanese, but there they are. This is a bond, and it helps Japanese companies, it helps Chinese companies, it helps Korean companies who have the diaspora over there. We don't have a diaspora, we have a diaspora up here. Can you just move up, please? What happened when slavery was abolished in the early 19th century, the British, who were very ethical in their own way, but with all due respect, they managed a way around their ethics, as they always do. What they said is, we won't have slavery, but we will have people signed on contract and sent them to Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname. These three countries where they held sway, they and the Dutch. So you had thousands of people being sent in boats to the other side of the world on a contract. They were called agreements, and thereby came the name Girmitia. Girmitias were those who signed agreements with the colonial power for 3 years, saying that you will go here, you'll be paid, you'll be given food, shelter, etc. They were so poor, they didn't know what they were doing. Most of them signed with their thumbs. Now, when that happened, these people migrated, and after 30, 40, 50 years, their children didn't know what to do, they didn't know where India was. What they had was a transplanted India. Today in Trinidad, if you go somewhere outside the city or port of Spain, about 30, 40 kilometers, you see the tallest statue of Hanuman in the world. It's about 80 meters tall. But that's it. They have taken the India of that period with them, and they have transplanted it into these parts of the world. Now that diaspora, very respectfully, is very Indian, very Hindu, very Muslim, whatever they came from, but they live in an artificial world, which no longer is the India we know today. I had a professor, we send professors, the government of India sponsors and pays for professors to go and teach them Hindi and so on and so forth. This professor went, and he was in Trinidad, and he said, it was shocking, in Guyana, and he said nobody there knows Hindi. They know some Bhojpuri which they came with, and their forefathers, their grandfathers, whatever may have spoken it, but now they speak only the local language or English. So this is our diaspora, which is insignificant in economic terms and in cultural terms. But we still maintain it, and of course our politicians go there regularly to fly the flag and so on and so forth. But we don't have too much of an economic base. So we've had to set it up on our own. Whereas you have the Japanese, the Chinese, and so on and so forth. The Chinese are a fascinating example because they don't only rely on their diaspora, they rely on sheer economic and financial clout. The Chinese have plowed in the last 10 years over $250 billion in loans, in investments, and in infrastructure and so on, to the point where a lot of these countries are beholden to them. Venezuela has received $60 billion over the past decade, and it doesn't know how to pay it back. So it's mortgaged its oil for several years and continues to ship oil to to China, and it doesn't know what to do. And the Chinese, of course, are very happy to have this hold, I dare say. Brazil, on the other hand, Argentina also have realized that the Chinese clout financially is critical because their own budgets, as I told you, are not in good shape. Their political economies are not institutionally stable and therefore have run into problems. So as a result of which they rely on Chinese capital. The Chinese are very astute. They don't make any demands initially, but the agreements are very tight. Which means you pay back at an interest rate which is far higher than the concessional rate of the World Bank, say, or the IMF. And if you can't pay back, then we've got a hold. You will give us the land, or you will do whatever we ask you to do. And it's not easy dealing with the Chinese eventually. The Chinese also are dealing with a region where most of the countries that recognize Taiwan were in this part of the world. Today, that number has dwindled from 15 to 9 because they have gone back to recognizing China. Costa Rica, Panama, Dominican Republic, and so on have gone back to recognizing China because they realize that's where the money is. And the Chinese are aggressively pursuing not domination because they realize that the US is still the dominant power in the region militarily, but economically. And this poses a challenge even to us. Because if we want to do business here, if we want to get contracts, the best way to do it is to go in for big projects. For instance, the railways. We have tremendous expertise in railways, but we haven't managed to penetrate. Because we have to go in with capital, we have to go in with a certain degree of expertise, and we have to know how to do it. The Chinese have managed to build stadiums over here. We managed to build one stadium in Guyana with great difficulty. And that also because there were some people of Indian origin we could rely upon. But the Chinese don't even bother with that. They're like a bulldozer, a steamroller. So these are challenges we are coming up against. But as against that, as I said, there is a kind of benevolent collaboration in space. We are working with Brazil and Argentina and Colombia and other countries, Peru, in technology, info technology, for instance, in agricultural technology. Now this is being spread. It's like watering gradually through drip irrigation so that the fruits will come and show. What we need really is far higher profile. Our cultural profile, for instance, over there is massive. Hollywood is far more popular than Chinese cinema, although Chinese cinema has managed to enter commercially because they've got the clout. They have the connections through Hollywood or through whichever, so they manage to actually distribute their films, they manage to subtitle their films, they manage to even dub their films, and they've got big productions. In our case, there are a few movies that are so popular that I know of Latin Americans who say, oh, kuch hota hai. They would not understand a word of the movie, but they love the songs, they love the movie, and they watch it several times. And Dev Das and so on and so forth. I said, how do you manage it? There are a few people who subtitle the films. They're so popular. Bollywood is so popular, but we cannot penetrate the market. Indian dance, culture, Indian art, all of this, Indian food. There are 5 restaurants, Indian restaurants in Sao Paulo. There are restaurants in almost every capital of Indian food. Now, the problem is that we don't make a consistent effort. And it still has to come about, but it will someday. Just like the Indo-Latin American community, which will come about through intermarriage, through settlements and so on. The settlement of Indians in Latin America is very minimal. We have a few thousand in Brazil around Sao Paulo where we have a consulate. Not even a few thousand, perhaps 2,000. We have a few scattered all over, and they are mainly people who are professionals. A few hundred in most countries who have sent. Mexico, for instance, there are several thousand, but mainly professional, which means it's a shifting population. 3 years, 5 years, and they move on. So this is the reality of India, Latin America. I could go on and on talking, and I'm sure I would like to, but I think it's come to an end, and I don't think I have too much more to say. Or if I do, I don't know if it will be that relevant, so I think I'll end over here. And thank you so much for being so patient and listening.
For question and answers.
Has no questions following is that you think that everybody understood what you said and there's nothing more to explain. So I'm very happy with that.
Sorry, one question.
Could you tell us something about the education system in Latin America? Yeah.
Education has largely depended upon the mastery of language. I'm talking about international education. They have high levels, high standards of education, but it's again, it reflects the inequality, because the less privileged sections of the population don't have access to very good education. Nevertheless, in terms of the spread of education, because of the higher per capita standards and so on, and a higher social consciousness, and I must admit, in this context, I may be being a little too frank, but because it's a less stratified society than that of India, the education has been far more widespread. Now, coming to relevant education, it can be a bit of a problem, because again, I can only talk about my experience in Latin America, my personal experience and my experience in India. The advantage we've had in India is that we're an English-speaking population. So access to texts and instruction in English, let's face facts, that is the more relevant, because technology has developed through the medium of English. In our own languages, in our own vernacular, it's not been so easy. So because we've had a massive access to instruction and text in English language, we've had the advantage of a section of our population, at least a massive section, being able to get access to better, let's say, levels of instruction in certain technologies and in certain other areas. The Latin Americans have not been so fortunate. Their access to instruction has been through their native languages, just Spanish and Portuguese. And so they've had to rely upon the texts in those languages and being cut off of the English-speaking world to a large extent. They're veering around more and more towards the English-speaking world, and so they're learning better about what we know. And not that the Spanish and Portuguese medium of instruction is deficient, but they have not had access to certain cutting-edge technologies. The other thing is that it's been a far more relaxed kind of education system than ours. I mean, the Indian child goes through far more exacting standards. Parents are always on top of you, exam mein padho, ye karo, wo karo. Mathematics and so on are our strengths, and this is true, and it's very relevant. It's not the case in Latin America. They have first-class people in literature. They've had a string of Nobel laureates, for instance, and that shows you that they are a very highly thinking people. But at the same time, if you were to ask them to solve certain problems, it's not so easy. There are very few patented technologies that have come out of the US compared to, say, even India. And today, the reason why our ICT is doing so well in that part of the world is because our people have developed software programs, our people have developed technologies and so on and so forth, which are very relevant and which are easy to disperse. In agriculture, they've done far better than us. And we have learned from them also. The exchange is on. So in a very broad sense, I would say that we've been more fortunate. We've also been perhaps more disciplined in terms of our educational spread and in terms of our intensity than the Latin Americans. But they've done all right, and in terms of egalitarian spread of education, at least, they've done pretty well. I hope that answers to some extent. I have personally lectured at some universities. The problem is funds, what we need, because travel does cost a lot. There is a very interesting program which I think your university could get hold of. It's sponsored by the Ministry of External Affairs entirely. We give the Indian Technical Economic Cooperation, ITEC, It's a program whereby we sponsor and we pay for everything from A to Z, from the course fees to travel fees to the stipend, etc. Everything. The candidate pays nothing. These are mainly for graduate students or postgraduate students in leading technical institutions, NIIT, Railways Institute, even things like income tax, and now we've even introduced English courses like in AppTech and so on and so forth. So we offer on an average 500 to 600 scholarships in Latin America, the whole region, every year. About half of them are availed, partly because it's a very poor system of propagation, and the recruitment is dependent upon local institutions, because local governments have to advertise it, interview candidates, because our embassies are limited. Embassies in the capital, and the rest of the country doesn't get to know about it. So because of those reasons, very few people get to know about it, and even fewer avail of it, and then they come here for 4 weeks to 4 months approximately, which is not difficult. Now, if the Vidyapeeth Vishwavidyalaya was to do this, I think it would be a good idea to even talk to the Ministry of External Affairs, and you can even get a few of these candidates to come to your university and avail of courses here, and the Ministry of External Affairs would sponsor it. Apart from that, there are also possibilities of MOUs between your university and Latin American universities, and I can even recommend some names, which either humanities or even technical courses would be a very good idea. Of course, I'd be happy to do that. The first thing to do, Professor, is to perhaps talk to even the ambassadors of those countries over here. I will make the initial moves, and I'll talk to some ambassadors. I know most of them who are posted in Delhi, and I'll ask them if there are universities. You can let me know which would be the disciplines in which you would be interested in collaboration. We'll have to find some degree of commonality or homogeneity, particularly the English language. We'll have to find either faculty members, in this case, I presume, or otherwise certain levels. You can let me know which levels of people you would be willing to take on in exchange or send. And if you send your people out, it's not easy. There are some Indians in Latin American universities, but it always helps to have some degree of knowledge of the language. So we can work around that. But I think, yes, in principle, I don't see any problem. I'll make some initial moves, and then I can ask you to take over.
Any other questions, please?
Good afternoon. How can India reach at the position of top 5 countries? How can India reach at the position of top 5 countries in the world?
Top 5 countries in the world? Well, I think in terms of purchasing power parity, GDP, we are somewhere there already, 6th or so. And on several parameters, we are in fact better off than most countries. We have a very stable democracy. So it all depends upon your perspective. When you say top 5 countries, I'd say that in terms of which other country do you know with the size of population that we have that has been so stable in terms of its democracy. You don't Indonesia and Brazil, you've seen what is happening. So in terms of the sheer stability of your democracy, you are doing very well. In terms of your health parameters, abolition of polio or whichever, smallpox and so on, you're doing pretty well too. Life expectancy, not bad. Now, the thing you have to do is see where you belong. You belong to the very large population category. So you should be talking about the very large population category, which would include, say, the US, China, maybe Indonesia and Brazil and so on and so forth. I think in the very large population category, we are doing pretty well. Look at our GDP growth. It all depends on the parameter you want to measure. In terms of GDP growth, we are the #1 in the world today. You must, my perspective is that we are 1.25 billion people, and of this, about 400 to 500 million people are carrying out the superhuman task of carrying another 800 million people along, who have not had opportunities, who are burdened by the history of caste, of poverty, of tradition, of obscurantism, and those poor people have not had a chance. We've just come in this century into a growth phase which we hope will be sustained, and it is 1/3 of our population, if I may make a wild guess, that is carrying the rest along. We need, as Professor Dhar said, to take advantage of the demographic dividend, get more of our youth involved in the democratic growth phase, so that they can become drivers instead of people who avail of this growth. So I think in that sense, I think we are among the top 5. If you see, depends upon your perspective. Of course, if you're taking the perspective of per capita income, perhaps not, but even there, as I said, in terms of per capita growth, we're not doing badly. In terms of per capita GDP, we're doing all right.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Shri Vaishnav Vidyapeeth Vishwavidyalaya, to present token of remembrance to our special guest, Mr. Deepak Bhojwani. Thank you, sir. Now, I request Dr. Rajiv Shukla, Director, Shri Vaishnav School of Management, to propose vote of thanks.
Person for the first Foreign Policy Lecture Series, Honorable Vice Chancellor Dr. Upendra Dhar, Head of Institutions and Departments, Faculty and Staff Colleagues, and my dear students. We are privileged and deeply indebted to Ambassador Deepak Bhojwani for sharing his invaluable knowledge and wisdom on the theme of India's relations with Latin America and the Caribbean. He elaborated and shown the geographical insight pictures of global business environment in his own unique way. Indeed, traveling for business along with Ambassador Bhojwani to various parts of the globe was very interesting and joyous. Ambassador has also addressed the role and importance of BRICS and ISBA in Indian foreign policy, and about existing and potential collaboration in automobile, sugar, steel and iron industries, and opportunity lost to leverage the Girmitia effect in the favor of Indian economy. We sincerely hope that you will continue to benefit from your knowledge and wisdom in future as well. We also extend our sincere thanks to Ananta Center, New Delhi, and Tata Group of Companies for their valuable support in organizing this lecture series SVV. And once again, I thank all present here in the auditorium. Thank you very much.
Now I request the gathering to rise for national anthem.
The back side, please.
जन गण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तब शुभ नामे जागे तब शुभ आशीष मांगे गाए तब जय गाथा जन गण मंगल दायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
भारत माता की
HOIs and HODs to proceed for lunch in the board.
By the time I passed out, I was telling myself that I've been through a degree factory. It was punched, labeled and packaged with a degree. That was it. I think there's a huge difference between my days and these. College of Commerce, and then I went through Law College, and it's unfortunate. We had about, I don't know how many students we have to a class here. 60. Sydenham College in those days, you required a distinction to get in. At least 65. I managed to get in. There were 120 of us in a class. in a single class, and of that, about 30 to 40% were, and they had to pick up instruction in English. It was so unfair. And we had very good friends. I mean, I had the chaps outside the class, so everything was okay. We used to speak Bambaya, Hindi, whatever. But it was impossible for them to get through, and I just think that, first of all, एक language policy, पता नहीं आप लोगों का क्या ख्याल है? I think it's
all of us, none of us who were born into English, we learn it. So is that a problem? Do you find that you can work in the global environment with what you take from here? These are issues which are interesting for me because I left the educational world a long time back. And it's so long back that I don't know what it's like to be a student, although I keep learning wherever I am. But it's not the same being a student where you're subjected to a discipline all the time and to be somebody who checks it occasionally. So I'd like to get your views. Do any of you feel you've actually gained significantly from your time in university? Do you feel you could have done something else and done as well or better? Anyone? All of you seem to be happy where you are. That's very good. That I think the credit goes to a large extent to the university. This is very good because also I was talking the other day, just now, to the faculty, and there are approximately 60 students to a class. Of course, in the PhD cases, that doesn't apply. But it's very interesting because when I was in university in Bombay, long time back, we had over 100 to a class, and I found it was impossible for any professor to impart any degree of relevant education. Of course, part of the problem was us. We were very unruly, we were rowdy, we wanted to go out of class and see a movie. The quality of the faculty was terrible in those days. In fact, I've been interacting with the faculty and I find that you people are lucky, the students, that you have faculty like this who are so well prepared, who are so dedicated. In our case, they were dedicated, but I don't think they were well prepared. We had somebody teaching us commercial correspondence who I found had no idea, apart from certain very rigid formats which he knew about. He had no idea about commercial correspondence, and so on and so forth. But today you have much better faculty at your disposal. You have a much more flexible and supple and versatile curriculum to learn from. But I'm sure that the burden therefore is much higher. Plus, there are many more challenges. It's not as easy finding a job today, a good job. So, do you all feel confident? And is the technical field more attractive to you than the humanities? Yes? I'll take that as a yes. Silence means a yes. So there's nobody here who feels they would rather go for humanities? No. Okay, in the technical field, is it engineering that is the most attractive? Yes? Engineering is the most attractive, so that still prevails. Medicine isn't taught here, so I presume that obviously does not stand as an option. So if it's engineering, is there any field of engineering that today would be more attractive than another? Somebody? Anyone? IT? IT is growing in importance?
IT and computer science.
Computer sciences. So are we going to the edge of that field? I mean, for instance, my son is doing computer coding. He's doing a very, very intensive course in computer coding in China. And he tells me there are 4 disciplines, four say, avenues. One is the blockchain, one is big data, one is artificial intelligence, and one other which I can't remember.
End-to-end, machine learning.
Perhaps. So these are areas which are frontier areas. Is anybody working on these over here?
Actually, sir, the students are majorly from the management. Basically.
Okay, this is from management.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're not on the technical field. You are in the humanities. But how do you relate your work to the technical world? Because this is also a technical university. You feel you need a technical background? Would it help to do a B.Tech and then do management? Precisely, yeah. But increasingly in this world where specialization is important, you feel management. I did management when I was in college also, but I found it such a general discipline that it was more on human relations, a little bit of psychology and so on. I came away not knowing if I had learnt anything significant. I mean, X theory, Y theory, generalizations like that. And I found it's much more important to do hard disciplines like financial management, for instance, which was a very tough discipline. So I don't know if our colleges are going more into harder management disciplines, or are we sticking to very generalized management curriculum? This is important, I think, because today I have to be involved in the management of an engineering company, but I have no engineering background. So as a result of which, I've got to learn or I've got to delegate. And delegation, of course, is a very important part of management, but still, unless you have that basic knowledge. So, do you combine here, you have a credit system, including in management, right? So you combine technical courses with the management curriculum?
Actually, sir, we have only 2 years that program, management program. So there is a specialization. Finance is one, HR, human resource, marketing, IT.
Yeah, that of course, the standard divisions of...
And also we have some special courses like family business and entrepreneurship. And what is the international business?
Yeah. But none of these carry extra credits for any technical courses? No. So that is interesting because I found that my management education was incomplete without having some technical background. For instance, if I am to manage a pharmaceutical company and if I have some idea of chemical engineering, I think it will be definitely very significant. In fact, if anything, it's a force multiplier. Or if I'm dealing with a company that manufactures machinery, equipment, automobiles, then it helps to have some mechanical engineering behind me. I got into management after having done social studies. In high school, I did my senior secondary certificate with not even physics and chemistry. So my physics, chemistry instruction was up to the 10th standard. In the next final 2 years of my school, I didn't even do, it was still the 9th standard. I got my SSC certificate in the 11th. And then I went into college. And I did some management, some economics and so on and so forth, but very generalized. I find that specific and detailed discipline, detailed for want of a better word, engineering, the sciences, physics, chemistry are far more exacting disciplines. And they leave you with something which is very precise. I mean, for me, remembering things which I learned about mathematics and so on, still stay with me. But about management or human resources and so on, not too much. So that's why I'm trying to understand whether we should orient our courses more towards specifics and detailed studies of technical discipline, rather than, fine, management, not everybody knows what management is all about, but once you start reading it, you find it's almost common sense. And in fact, a lot of our terrific managers here, whether they are family managed companies or otherwise, have never done management. They've never done a management degree. They don't need an MBA to run a company. They run it very well. Because they may have their own ideas or they may have their own ethos. And they use those ideas and that ethos to work their companies or to work their businesses. I'm not sure if Ritesh Agarwal of OYO studied any management, but look at what he has created. So anyway, that's of course maybe exceptional. So what I'm trying to understand is how you people see yourselves today. Do you feel that you've got into a tunnel and you have to come out at the other side? Or do you feel you're in a field where you can, you take a direction and you go that way, but you can deviate a little bit, or you can sit back and look horizontally also?
example, if I want to recruit for any media related job, so I need to update myself according to the market, what is going in the market. So I need to update myself according to it. If I am in a tunnel, I'm not getting too aware about that what is going out, in the market.
Which
so
means you cannot widen your horizon.
Yes.
Right. But do you study comparative theories also? For instance, supposing you have a particular theory that is being taught or you're working on, do you turn around and say, okay, how do they do this in China? Are they successful or no? Do you think out of the box? Do you think your course encourages you to think outside
yes,
the box?
Sir. Yes, sir. Actually, there is so many things which is really related towards the work, because as I have worked experience before joining this course also. At that time, I don't have any idea that I can relate it with my work. But now I am realizing it is really necessary to see all these aspects also, so that I can update myself and I can work betterly.
So you've done you came out of the workplace?
Yes, sir.
Into a 2-year MBA degree?
Yes, sir.
How long did you work?
So I have a 5 years of experience.
Okay. How many of you have worked and then come into the MBA? Can you put your hands up? Can you put your hands high up? The rest of you have just come straight into your MBA. Please keep your hands up. I want to just see. There are about 4 of you who have started the MBA course with work experience behind you. The others haven't. So if you haven't had work experience behind you, that means you're not going to be able to think your field. You're not going to be able to relate your experience. I went back into college. I did 2 years of college, commerce and economics, and then my father asked me to work with him, 4 years. And I went back into college to get my degree, to sit for the exam, because I needed a degree. I went back and I was convinced I was in a degree factory. They were producing us, stamping us, chapoing us and turning us out. So useless. This is Bombay University. And I did a law degree after that, which was a little bit better because it's a more precise discipline. But the economics, management and commerce degree that I did was not worthless, because I made something of it in the last 2 years. And I started asking questions, for instance, precisely this, that how would this particular theory work in China? And the professor thought I was, he'd had 100 students in the class, and he said, look, let's not deviate from the curriculum. That was his answer to me. Now, since I had the benefit of work experience, I wanted to make it relevant. I said, what am I going to do with this theory, or what am I going to do with this learning if I can't relate it to my daily life? So I find that it really helps, if not work experience, at least go into a workplace, an office, and tell somebody that, look, there is this theory of management. Okay, go to an HR department if you are doing, say, HR, in a management course, an MBA course. Spend 3 days there as an intern or 1 week and say, acha, theek hai, what do you need to do? Find out how those people recruit. Currently, by some fluke, kuch aisi baat, ittifaq se, I happen to be managing a company in India, a unit in India, which has a factory in Rajkot, which makes engineering equipment, rollers and tables, which crush cement and so on and so forth. It's a very technical thing which I don't know anything about. At least I didn't, and I'm learning a little bit. But I have to manage the HR, the finance and everything of that, which means budgeting, which means work in progress, which means finished goods, calculations and so on, and HR. HR is a very important part because that's something I can at least understand. And I find it is extremely technical. How do you make a job description? How do you relate a job description? And how do you make sure that the person whose degree is being shown to you is adequate and so on and so forth. So if I was to be, say, reverse the situation and be in an MBA, I think I would like to go for a week into that particular company and say, I want to sit with you as an intern and help you for free and learn what do you do? How do you prepare a CTC, that's cost to company. Every company for an employee has a CTC, which is that what do I pay? How do I break down the salary structure, the provident fund, the taxable, the non-taxable, etc. How do I relate that to what I am learning? How do I relate my management practices? Do we even think about when we have to start a business, should we buy property or should we lease it? And if we have to lease it, what are the issues we need to look at? Or are we going to go into the real world like virgins? It's like being married and then having a child when you're a virgin. You have no idea what the real world is about. You're looking at starting a business or running a business, and you have no idea what you should really be looking for. Because you have taken someone else's ideas, you have tried to understand them without relating them to your own experience. If you cannot relate an idea to an experience, then at best it is a priori. It's like good and bad. How do you know good from bad? It's when you do something good or when you do something bad. For instance, when I was studying law, I was told by the professor that, look, there are certain aspects of the taxation law which allow you to take a tax break, and these are legal. So there was at one time a tax law which allowed you to sell, say, a table. I bought this table or bought a painting for 10,000 rupees, and I can sell it for 100,000 rupees after 5 years because it has appreciated. And the tax wala wouldn't touch that income. That income, 90,000 rupees, was tax-free for me. They changed the law several years ago because people were misusing it. Now this is directly related to my experience in law or in management. Then the other example, should you rent or take something on lease? Should you have an annual maintenance contract for equipment when you're managing a company? Or should you take a chance? Like the government of India, we have, for instance, the foreign ministry, we have about 4,000 cars which are the property of the ministry. We don't lease them, we buy them. But we don't insure them. Because somebody has calculated that it will be cheaper to repair a car rather than pay the premium for so many Mercedes cars every year and never have to cash in on that premium. Things like this. So if you do not relate your experiences to your theories or your ideas, eventually what you're going to have to do is carry those ideas in your head and wait for an opportunity to come to interpret that idea or to apply it to a situation on the ground. So I hope a lot of you can do that. I don't know if the university curriculum or the course discipline allows you to do that, but if you have a chance for an internship, grab it. Whether you're during the course or you do have.
Yeah, sir, it is compulsory. 8 weeks internship is compulsory after second semester. That is after 1 year's completion of the program.
8 weeks internship. Yeah, but do you guide the people to where they should go, or do they have to choose it themselves?
No. We help them.
You help. Yeah. So my advice is, please do as much as you can outside of the university. Even related, if you go to an ice cream parlor, and if you're doing, say, financial management, ask him what his intake is, what his profit, how does he calculate his profit, how does he calculate whether he should have a higher turnover or less turnover, does he go for margins or does he go for volume, etc. Try and relate it, because only when you talk to people on the ground, only when you get into the real world, will that idea make sense to you. Otherwise, you have to carry those. I'm not saying education by itself is not useful. You can learn theoretically. But then you're having to carry all that within you and wait for an opportunity. कि अच्छा हाँ, ये financial management में हमने ये सीखा है, अब हमें यहाँ apply करना होगा. और मौका जब मिले तो apply करेंगे. तब तक आपके दिमाग से छूट जाए या कभी मौका ना मिले, so what's the point? Whereas if you have the experience, it comes from within you then, and you apply it immediately. That's what I did. That's what I learned. Because that's why I say that when I went through college and came out 4 years later, at least in my economics and finance, economics and management degree, I felt like I had been through a factory and I'd just been stamped. I managed to get a certain certain grade which I didn't even think, I didn't even bother to see my marks. I got through the foreign service exam, through the civil service exam. I made it into the foreign service, and I don't think my education in college had anything to do with it. My law degree helped because I did 2 papers, or 1 paper in law, but very curious, I did commerce, economics, management in 4 years. I did 3 years of law, and I did 1 law paper. I did 2 history papers. I did a paper in French, and I did a paper in international relations. Now this was the IAS optional papers which I did. Can you imagine? But I got through. I didn't bother to touch economics, not because it wasn't scoring, but because I felt that what I had learned theoretically, I couldn't apply. I just don't know why. I mean, I don't know what happened. When I did law, after the 2nd year, I don't know what it's like now. I had a 3-year course, and the 3rd year is for procedural law. I don't know, you people don't have a law faculty, but in law, I think even today, you do 2 years of disciplines, and then the 3rd year, you have procedural law, which means criminal and civil procedure, which is very tough, how to apply the law, how to practice, and you have optional papers, and I took international law and international economics law. Now in international economics law, I studied, when I did my first 2 years, I came 2nd in the university. Not because of anything else, but because I wrote so much that I managed to spill it out. Contract Act, Companies Act, ये वो जो ज़्यादातर मैं तो भूल ही गया हूँ. अब Companies Act का कुछ थोड़ा बहुत याद है, जो भी आपकी, that's what I'm saying. इतना मैंने cram कर दिया that when my brother was seeing me study, he said, "What are you doing?" So I said, "मैं क्या करूँ?"
Income tax law is so big, my head is so big.
How can I get it in? But somehow I managed, and I came 2nd in the university. Can you imagine if I came 2nd in university, what those other poor fellows went through? I mean, you can't possibly keep it all in your head. And we did not have the benefit of talking to real lawyers, of going to court and seeing. We had some very good professors who were actually practicing lawyers. And they told us, कि भी देखो court में ये है. One of them actually set up a mock court. And he said for the law of torts, for instance, the law of torts is fascinating. It's an English derivative where, say, if I have a dangerous dog, and if that dog bites somebody, that's negligence on my part. I'm supposed to keep that dog in control. अगर उसने किसी को काटा तो मेरी गलती, and I get punished. Things like that. So that was fascinating, learning from case law. But most of the law was so theoretical, we never got to apply it. So in that, I came 2nd in the university, got a scholarship, went into the 3rd year, and I found procedural law was the same. Okay, ठीक है, you have to know what to say, what to do, which evidence applies, etc. And then was the optional paper of international law, which I did all right. And there was international economic law. Now, international economic law related to an English, Western sort of priority, which is कि भाई देखो, when we invest, our investment must be kept safe. कोई nationalize ना करे. That was the perspective from which international economic law was created by Westerners. And you had a particular author who the university said, बस ये ही पढ़ो. ये एक ही है, like a kunji it was. You have to read only this, and all the previous papers I saw were only asking questions based on that book. Sir, because I said, is this all there is to international economic law? And I did so poorly in that that I don't know where I came. I'm not sure where. But it didn't matter, because I felt that I hadn't learned much. Whatever I had learned, I did on my own. So here is the tragedy of having to go into a tunnel, where you don't feel you're breathing in a field, a green field where you can look around you, learn, appreciate, and breathe and imbibe. If you're in a tunnel, all you have to do, because the atmosphere in a tunnel is claustrophobic, it's suffocating, you just want to get through the tunnel and get out, because that's your aim. And I hope that's not happening to you all. Because if that does, then gentlemen and ladies, please get out. I'm not saying that you should leave this university, but get out of it in some way. Because if you find that you're suffocating, then it's not for you. If you find you'd rather paint, then go ahead and paint. If you find that you want to direct a movie, but go ahead. Talk to somebody, go to Bombay, find somebody who'll take you up as a cameraman or whatever. Do whatever your heart tells you, or whatever your mind tells you. Because more often than not, this is what you need to do. Because I found that, fortunately for me, I sat for the exam. Otherwise, I don't know what I would have done. I told myself, if I don't get into any service, I was willing to go into any service. I said, अगर railways मिले कोई बात नहीं, मैं railway platform संभालूंगा, लेकिन मुझे ये करना है, civil service करना है. And I got into the foreign service and I was fine because I studied international relations, I studied French, I studied history, all on my own, just for the exam. I had not done an arts degree, nothing like that, just for the exam. And I found that I was very happy doing that. I studied Mughal history and I did a paper in that and so on. I followed what my heart told me, and my mind disciplined itself to follow my heart, to follow what I wanted, to follow what I found interesting. And I made it. And if I hadn't made it, I'd have had to go into law because I said, fine, boy, option kya hai? I'll have to do a law degree, kam se kam, tankha to milegi. But I would have suffocated if I had been in law. I don't know. I might have. I don't know. But I'm glad I did what I did, and I'm glad I followed my heart. Sorry, I've been talking myself. Is there anybody of you who wants to say, please?
Thank you, sir, for your speech. As you are mentioning that these degrees are like sort of a tunnel if we don't explore more and go into a field. But as you have only mentioned it, that if you hadn't had that degree, you wouldn't have been able to sit in the exam itself. So here in India, the education system is like that only, that degrees are sort of gate pass for us. That if you have that gate pass, you are allowed to enter in this exam, you are allowed to enter in civil services or so on and so forth. So basically my question is that how do you suggest this Indian education system will change? We cannot change it as a students, we are just a part of it. If we try to fall out of the line, like you gave an example of Bombay, that if you want to direct a movie, you go there and you do this. I've done my MBA in media management from EMRC, so I went to Bombay. There, of course, in particularly this field, they do not ask for the degree, they ask for work experience. So I already made around 16 short films in Indore itself because I knew that my degree won't work there. So even if you are MBA or whatever you are, they ask you, have you had any work experience? So yeah, that mattered particularly in that field. But rest in all, like technical fields, management field, as soon as you apply for any job or in any company, they ask, have you done any degree in HR? Have you done any degree in management? So what we will do if we, don't get into this tunnel and, how can we directly apply it anywhere?
I agree with you. In fact, you're absolutely right. One of the first things I said was that, do you feel you're in a tunnel when you're doing your degree? I felt I was in a tunnel when I was doing my degree, and I had to get out of the tunnel to get through the tunnel, not out, but to get through the tunnel to sit for the exam. But that was because I was sitting for the civil service exam. Now, it's not difficult, it's not impossible if you put your mind to it to do two things. I was doing my degree in law while I was studying for the competitive exam. Now, the fact is that I was studying history, Indian history plus Mughal history. I was doing international relations in my law course. I was studying French, and I was studying one more paper which I did, law, international relations, history, French, right? I was doing all these things because what my aim was to get this chap, which means that through college, I didn't have to do very much. I just had to, go through class, finally got through my exam, and that was it. So you have to see your priorities. First of all, if you're going to do something that demands a degree, you go through it, fine, okay? Everybody needs, more or less, I agree with you, our system locks us into an environment where if you don't have the chap, you cannot even appear. Fair enough, you do that. But at the same time, you have to see whether that degree is so relevant to you. Because for instance, if you find the BTech is a tunnel, but say BSc is an open field, supposing, then you can get out of BTech and go into a BSc with a more broad field. I'm just giving you an example. You have to find your own. Because eventually if it's a degree you want, you don't have to do a particular degree only. Unless you feel that yes, you want a BTech because you want to go into an engineering field. But if you find then that BTech becomes a tunnel, then are you sure when you get out of the tunnel you'll be successful at the job that you're applying for? Maybe not. That's for you to evaluate. If I'm going, say, for medicine, I want to be a doctor, then I will have to go through an MBBS. Even if I find it a tunnel, I hate cutting up corpses, I hate doing this, I hate doing that, but I have to do it. Because wo to chahiye hi chahiye. Hai na? So that is a given. If you feel that that end is worth the tunnel. But if not, and if you're going through the degree without knowing what is at the other end, then it's better to have the field idea. Okay, at least I'm learning something while I go along the way, and who knows, I may find something more interesting that eventually awaits me. That's one thing. The second thing is that you can keep your options open, because a degree doesn't mean you'll have to take up a job. When you see, as I was giving you this example of Oyo, this Ritesh Agarwal, at the age of 25, he is group CEO of a $1 billion company. He's just employed Aditya Sinha, who was CEO of Indigo, who's now working under him. The point I'm making is that you have to see what grabs your imagination. And fine, I take your point that in certain aspects you need a degree, but not in all. If it's entrepreneurship that attracts you, you can do that too without an MBA. Some of the most successful entrepreneurs have no idea about what an MBA is. You don't need it, it's intrinsic. So it really is your interpretation of what you're doing. And I don't think you need to be field trapped. That's what I was coming from. You don't need to feel trapped. I know it's difficult to step out of that trap because you feel insecure. कि अच्छा ठीक है, अगर मैं ये नहीं किया तो फिर कौन नौकरी दिलाएगा? डिग्री नहीं है तो फिर इंटरव्यू कहाँ से मिलेगा? But I think if you use your imagination, you can keep your options of getting a job also open. And I can guarantee you this, having worked also and having experience of recruitment, I would much rather take somebody who comes across in an interview with a chalu degree rather than a higher degree who comes across as somebody who's just learned something in the college. Somebody who comes across as imaginative, whether he's doing environment, health, security, whether he's doing furnace interview for furnace operator, or whether he's doing an interview for a molding supervisor. If he shows imagination, I prefer him to a fellow who's got an MTech degree in molding or whatever, but whose eyes don't have that light. This is important. You have to have a certain passion. You have to have a certain interest. Otherwise, your life also will become dull.
Yeah. No question.
Everybody wishes they had a second chance so they could choose certain things. So choose well, young people. You're very fortunate. You're at this stage in your lives where you still have choices. Don't feel insecure, because if you have faith in yourself, and if you can impose that discipline upon yourself, both are important. You may have faith, but faith can very easily turn into overconfidence. So have faith, but then keep discipline. Make sure that you impose that discipline upon yourself to be able to set goals and to achieve them. And then the world is yours. Your world is yours. Thank you.